I never thought I'd find myself here, trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, guilt pressing down on me like a heavy weight. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. My dad's best friend, Mark, had always been around. Family gatherings, summer barbecues, even those rare father-daughter outings where he tagged along. He was practically part of the family, a man whose laugh echoed through our home and whose charm seemed to light up every room he entered. But lately, something had shifted. It was subtle at first. His lingering glances, the way his hand would rest a little too long on my shoulder, his playful teasing that felt like it carried a weight I couldn't quite name. At 23, I wasn't a child anymore, and Mark made sure to remind me of that in ways that left me feeling confused. Was I imagining it? Or was there something deeper, something neither of us dared to acknowledge? I could feel the chemistry building between us, unspoken and forbidden. It was the kind of tension that made the air thicker when we were in the same room. The kind of thing I didn't want to admit existed but couldn't stop feeling. He'd flash me a smile, and my heart would race. Not out of fear, but something more dangerous. The night it all unraveled. We were hosting one of my dad's infamous poker nights. The house buzzed with the hum of male laughter, the clinking of beer bottles, and the faint scent of cigars. I had slipped away to the bathroom for a moment of peace when I heard the door creak open behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned to see Mark standing there. Growing up, I had always admired Mark in the way you might admire a favorite uncle, someone who seemed larger than life, who could tell a joke and have the whole room in stitches. But as I got older, the way I saw him began to shift. He was still that same charming man with a magnetic personality, but now I noticed things I hadn't before. The way his dark eyes softened when he looked at me, the effortless confidence in his smile, and the way his voice carried a certain warmth that made me feel safe. I wasn't blind to the fact that Mark had his flaws. He was married, though his relationship with his wife was a constant source of quiet tension. I'd overheard my dad mention more than once that Mark and Cheryl were on the rocks. Still, he had this way of masking his struggles, throwing himself into the role of the affable family friend, always ready to lend a hand or tell a story. And then there was me. I was still trying to find my footing in life, navigating a string of mediocre relationships and chasing a career that felt just out of reach. I often felt invisible, like the world had already decided my story wasn't worth telling. But Mark, he saw me. Not just as my dad's daughter, but as me. It started innocently, or at least I thought so at the time. A compliment here, a shared laugh there. His gaze would linger a moment too long, and my heart would betray me, fluttering in a way I didn't want to admit. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, if the electricity I felt in those stolen moments was one-sided. And then there were the touches. Small, almost imperceptible at first. A brush of his hand against mine as we passed in the kitchen. His palm resting briefly on the small of my back as he maneuvered past me at a crowded family gathering. They were fleeting, easy to dismiss, but they left an imprint that I couldn't shake. There was an undeniable connection between us, one that we both felt but neither dared to name. It wasn't just physical. It was the way he'd look at me when he thought no one was watching, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. But the guilt gnawed at me. This wasn't just any man. This was my dad's best friend. And yet, the temptation was always there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for one of us to break. The air between us felt thicker every time Mark and I crossed paths, like the space itself carried the weight of everything unsaid. After that night at the poker game, I found myself noticing him even more. His presence, his scent, the quiet strength in the way he carried himself. And I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on me, as though he was wrestling with something he couldn't quite name. One evening, a week after the gathering, Mark stopped by the house under the pretense of helping my dad with a plumbing issue. My dad had stepped out to pick up supplies, leaving us alone. The silence felt louder than any conversation we could have had. I was sitting on the couch when he entered the room, wiping his hands on a towel. "Your dad's going to be a while," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, avoiding his eyes, though I could feel them on me. "Do you want something to drink?" I asked, my voice betraying the tremor I felt inside. "No, I'm good," he replied, his steps deliberate as he crossed the room and sat beside me. Too close. My heart hammered in my chest, the proximity sending a ripple of electricity through me. His knee brushed against mine, and I froze, the contact setting my skin alight. It wasn't intentional. Or was it? I glanced at him, catching the flicker of something in his eyes, something that mirrored the conflict brewing inside me. I shouldn't be sitting this close, he said softly, almost to himself, his voice tinged with both regret and longing. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Maybe not, I whispered, but I didn't move. Neither did he. His hand rested on the cushion between us, close enough that the back of his fingers grazed mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental, like the world had narrowed down to this one tiny point of contact. I didn't pull away, and neither did he. You're not a kid anymore, he murmured, his voice barely audible. It's hard not to notice. Heat rushed to my face, and I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. Mark. His name was a plea, though I wasn't sure if I was begging him to stop or to keep going. He reached out then, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face. The touch was light, almost reverent, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. I turned toward him, and the space between us felt like it was disappearing. His hand lingered at my cheek, his thumb tracing the edge of my jaw. The moment stretched on, charged with an energy that made it impossible to breathe. But then he pulled back, the spell breaking as quickly as it had been cast. I shouldn't have said that, he muttered, standing abruptly. The tension hung in the air, unresolved, leaving me aching for something I couldn't name but desperately wanted. The silence in the room felt deafening as Mark stepped closer, his hesitation palpable. I was standing near the kitchen counter, pretending to occupy myself with tidying up, but my hands trembled, betraying the storm raging inside me. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, weighted with emotion. This isn't right, he murmured, almost to himself. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel this. I turned to face him, my breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't think, as the pull between us became impossible to ignore. Every rational thought screamed for me to step back, to put space between us, but my heart betrayed me. Mark. We can't, I said, though my voice wavered, and the words carried no conviction. I know, he replied, his gaze locked on mine. But I also know you feel it too. I know, he replied, his gaze locked on mine. But I also know you feel it too. His words sent a ripple through me, tearing down the walls I'd so carefully built. He took another step closer, and the distance between us became a breath, a fragile line neither of us dared to cross, yet both of us wanted to. When his hand came up to rest lightly on my waist, the warmth of his touch ignited something inside me. My eyes searched his, looking for hesitation, for regret, but all I saw was longing. Slowly, almost cautiously, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, as though testing the waters of something forbidden. I didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, my hands instinctively resting on his chest. The kiss deepened, filled with the weight of everything we'd kept bottled up. The yearning, the conflict, the unspoken emotions that had been simmering for weeks. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath ragged. This can't go any further, he said, though his hand lingered at the curve of my waist, betraying his words. I know, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But in that moment, we both knew we had already crossed a line, one we could never uncross. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us and the unbearable weight of what had just happened. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Mark had left, the echo of his footsteps still lingering in the hallway, and I stood there, leaning against the counter, replaying every moment of what had just happened. My lips still tingled from the kiss, my heart a chaotic rhythm that refused to settle. I felt different, like something inside me had shifted irreversibly. It wasn't just the kiss or the forbidden nature of it, but the realization of how tangled emotions could be. For weeks, I had convinced myself that what I felt was a fleeting attraction, something that would pass if I ignored it long enough. But now, there was no denying it. Mark's words played in my mind on a loop. This can't go any further. He was right, of course. There was too much at stake. His friendship with my father, his marriage, my own sense of morality. And yet, the part of me that ached for him refused to let go, clinging to the memory of his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I sat down on the couch, pulling my knees to my chest as a wave of guilt washed over me. What kind of person does this make me? I thought about my dad, the trust he had in Mark, and how I had shattered that trust without him even knowing. But there was another part of me, a quiet, stubborn voice that whispered, "It wasn't just you." Mark had felt it too. He had wanted it just as much as I had. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance. Mark didn't come around, and I avoided asking my dad about him, terrified that my voice would betray me. I tried to convince myself that it was for the best, that this distance was what we both needed to put things back to normal. And yet, late at night, I would find myself reliving it all. The way he held me, the way his words carried both longing and regret. A part of me knew we had made the right choice by stepping back. But another part couldn't help but wonder, if we had the chance, would we cross that line again? The story didn't feel over. Not really. It lingered in the air, unresolved, like an unfinished chapter waiting to be written.